Have you ever stopped to consider that what you think you know about the origin of faith might be completely wrong? What if I told you that even before Christ, before Muhammad, before Moses, there existed a powerful God, worshipped by millions of people in the heart of Africa? Shocking, isn't it? The mere idea that an African God could have come before all the great religions that have shaped the world is enough to shake anyone's convictions. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. A mystery hidden by history, a secret that can completely change your view of spirituality, the Bible, the Quran, and even the way we understand God himself. We often grow up believing that humanity's greatest spiritual references began with Judeo-Christian traditions or the revelation of Islam, but the truth is that there's much more to this narrative. What few know, and what almost no one dares to talk about, is that on African soil, rituals, beliefs, and organized worship of a god predate all these traditions. A God who was present in people's lives centuries before Moses received the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai, before Muhammad heard the voice of the angel Gabriel in the desert, before the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. And this is where things get even more interesting. Why isn't this information widely disseminated? Is there a deliberate effort to erase the presence of this African god from history? Or have we simply been taught to see only a partial version of the truth? These questions are not only provocative, they are necessary. Because if a god was worshipped long before the religions that dominate the world today, it means that humanity's faith has much deeper and more surprising roots than we imagine. Imagine for a moment the scene. Entire villages gathered, centuries before the Christian era, offering songs, sacrifices, and prayers to a deity who already represented creation, justice, and supreme power. Imagine that these people not only believed in spiritual forces, but had already developed a system of worship, symbols, and teachings that echo to this day in the religious traditions we know. It's possible that what we call newness in faith was already present, in a much older form, in African temples and altars. This isn't just a historical detail, it's a revelation that could upend everything we think about religion. Because if Africa already had a central deity, it leads us to reflect. Were Moses, Christ, and Muhammad influenced by earlier traditions? Could part of the message that has reached us be a distant echo of this ancestral worship? Or could this African god represent a lost key, a secret that explains why so many religions have common ground, despite their differences? It's precisely this kind of discovery that creates discomfort, shock, but also opens our eyes. After all, how many times have you wondered where certain ideas, symbols, and even commandments present in various spiritual traditions come from? Could the answer lie in this African god that history has tried to hide? The truth is, many people go through life without ever hearing about this revelation. And that's why this video is so important. Because today you'll learn what was hidden, what few had the courage to reveal. But prepare yourself. What you're about to discover isn't just information. It's a key that can transform your way of seeing the past, your faith, and even your own spirituality. Now, if you think you've understood everything about God, the Bible, and the history of religions, just wait until you hear what comes next. And before we delve even deeper into this mystery, I want to invite you to actively participate in this discovery. Because this isn't just any content. We're talking about a revelation that can shake up how you understand the history of faith and your own spirituality. So, I want to know your opinion. Have you ever heard of this African god who came before Christ, Muhammad, and Moses? Does your view of religion change after hearing something like this? Leave your comment below, because your participation is essential. Every opinion helps enrich this investigation and connects us as a community of truth seekers. And if this topic has resonated with you so far, don't forget to leave a like. This simple gesture shows YouTube that this content is relevant and helps more people discover this hidden truth. This is how, together, we can bring this kind of knowledge to many more people who are also thirsty for answers. Oh, and of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take this moment to subscribe and activate the bell. This way, you won't miss the next videos, because what's coming will surprise you even more. With each new episode, we'll delve deeper into mysteries that history has tried to erase. So, subscribe now and join us on this journey of revelations. When we talk about ancient African religions, many people are surprised because they've been conditioned to believe that spirituality began only with Abraham, Moses, Christ, or Muhammad. But the truth is that long before these central figures emerged, Entire peoples on the African continent already lived a profound relationship with the divine, with mystery, with eternity. Africa was not only the cradle of humanity, but also one of the cradles of faith, where people looked to the sky, nature, and the cycle of life, and saw the manifestation of a supreme power that needed to be revered. And here's a shocking detail. Many of the practices we recognize today in Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam already existed symbolically in African traditions centuries and even millennia before. It's striking to see how these African peoples weren't spiritually lost, as is often portrayed, but rather they had rituals, temples, priests, and even their own scriptures that guided community life. If you analyze, you'll see that the idea of sacrifice, purification through water, collective prayer, the concept of soul and spirit, all of this was already present, and not just vaguely present, but structured, organized, and passed down from generation to generation. This shows that when Moses brought the tablets of the law, he wasn't inaugurating humanity's contact with God, but rather continuing a tradition that already existed and that in many ways had clear echoes of African spirituality. Consider Egypt, for example. Long before the birth of Jesus, Egypt already worshipped a creator God, spoke of the afterlife, and the judgment of the soul before a divine tribunal. The Egyptian Book of the Dead features scenes that directly recall biblical descriptions of judgment and eternity. Is this a coincidence? Or are we witnessing a line of spiritual continuity, where revelation is transmitted in different ways, but always with roots much older than what we've been taught? When you look at this, you realize that perhaps the Bible isn't the beginning of history, but a chapter within something larger, which began much earlier on African soil. And it's not just in Egypt that we see these connections. Sub-Saharan peoples, such as the Yoruba, already spoke of a supreme creator God who stood above all things. This God was surrounded by spiritual messengers, entities who mediated the relationship between the human and the divine. Doesn't that sound familiar? This immediately brings to mind the idea of angels, cherubim, and even prophets as intermediaries. What we now call the Judeo-Christian tradition, in many ways, seems to draw from this ancient African source. But most people have never heard of it because there is a deliberate silence about these connections. And perhaps you're wondering, why haven't we been told this? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. History was written from a perspective that suited certain empires and dominant religions. Giving visibility to the fact that there was an African God before Moses, Christ, and Muhammad, who was already worshipped and respected, would call into question the idea that revelation began in Israel or the Arabian Peninsula. And what's most disturbing is that, when we study them in depth, we realize that many central elements of the Bible and the Quran not only resemble each other, but also seem to repeat practices, symbols, and archetypes that were already present in the heart of ancient Africa. This is why I made my digital book available to reveal the apocalypse, which you can download immediately through the first comment set. This book will help you discover all the mysteries of the apocalypse and transform your life. Access the first comment set to get your copy, because very few remain and will soon be withdrawn. Don't waste time. Click now and make sure your digital copy. This is the point at which many people experience a shock. Could it be that what we've been taught as the only truth is actually part of a much older and broader mosaic? Could it be that faith wasn't born in the Middle East, but was inherited and transformed from an African spirituality that already existed thousands of years ago? These questions don't have easy answers, but they need to be asked. After all, if there is a direct line connecting modern religions to the ancient beliefs of Africa, it completely changes the way we view our own faith. And the more you look, the more you realize the striking similarity. In ancient Egypt, for example, there was a belief that the heart would be weighed on a scale before the penalty of divine justice. Compare this to the biblical idea of the final judgment, where each person will be judged by their deeds. Is it a coincidence? Or are we facing the same message, transmitted in different languages, at different times, but with the same origin? Now consider, if this message was already alive in Africa long before the birth of Christ, Muhammad, or Moses, what does this tell us about who truly brought God's first revelation to humanity? This historical contextualization serves not only to generate curiosity, but to open our eyes. Because when we recognize that there is an African spiritual heritage that influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we understand that the roots of faith are deeper, older, and more universal than we've been told. And perhaps this explains why so many religious traditions, even geographically distant, share such similar symbols, words, and practices. And don't forget to get your digital book, Unraveling the Apocalypse. It is very important that you purchase it quickly before the copies run out, because everything traces back to a common source, a God who was already worshipped, an African God who came before all others. And at this point, I'd like you to join in this reflection. I want you to leave the word antiquity in the comments if you've heard that African religions predate Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. If this is new to you, comment on the phrase, "This changes everything," because your reaction is important and will demonstrate the extent to which this revelation is opening the eyes of those watching this video. When we speak of an African God who was worshipped even before Moses, Christ, or Muhammad, we're not talking about a mere myth, a baseless legend, but a central figure who structured the lives of entire peoples. This God was not merely an invention to explain nature. He was understood as the source of life, the supreme creator, the one who stood above all things visible and invisible. Imagine for a moment men and women who lived in times much older than those we know from the biblical narrative, gathered in temples, at altars, in great ceremonies, proclaiming songs to a God who represented the power of creation, the cycle of life, and eternity. This God was already recognized as the one who upheld the order of the universe. This is difficult for many people to accept, because we were taught to believe that the idea of a single, creator God only emerged with Abraham and was later revived in Christianity and Islam. But what history shows, and what remains still cry out, is that this concept existed on African soil long before. This God was not just another deity among others, as in many pagan pantheons. He occupied a central place, was the starting point, was the origin of everything. The people saw in him the power of creation, divine justice, and even the promise of an afterlife. Some peoples called this God differently. Each culture had its own name, but the essence was always the same: a supreme being beyond human comprehension, an eternal being who existed before all else. In some traditions, he was represented by the sun, not because the sun was God himself, but because the sun symbolized light, life, and warmth, something everyone needed to live. In other traditions, he was seen as the great invisible spirit, the one whom no one could touch or see directly, but whose presence was felt in all things. Notice how this connects with the biblical idea of an invisible yet everywhere present God, and with the Islamic conception of Allah as the one and only absolute. This African God was not only worshipped verbally, he was part of people's practical lives. Harvests were dedicated to him, battles were fought in his name, marriages were celebrated with his blessing. The idea that everything should begin with the invocation of the supreme God was already alive among these peoples long before the arrival of the religions we know today. Even symbols of power, such as the scepter, the crown, and the all-seeing eye, have their origins in these ancestral traditions, carrying spiritual meanings that were later appropriated by other peoples. And don't think that this God was just a distant, inaccessible figure. There was a sense of closeness, of care, of justice. He was not only the creator, but also the sustainer, the one who governed human destiny and demanded integrity, honesty, and reverence. Many stories told of this God rewarding goodness and punishing evil, just as we see in the most well-known scriptures today. Doesn't it sound familiar? Doesn't it remind you of the words of the prophets? This shows how there is a line of continuity that no one can deny. Now, something that makes everything even more intriguing is that African traditions already spoke of spiritual mediators, messengers between humans and the divine. They called them Orishas, spirits and guardians, but all subordinate to the supreme being. This structure strongly resembles the idea of angels, archangels, cherubim, and even prophets chosen by God. This shows that this African God was not just an isolated figure, but a center around which an entire organized cosmology revolved. This is why we must face this truth. The worship of this God already existed in a complex, profound, and structured way, long before the story of Moses in Egypt, long before Christ's arrival in Bethlehem, long before Muhammad received the revelation in the desert. And it's not just a matter of chronology, but of content. The messages, the symbols, and even the commandments were already there, albeit in a different language, albeit in a different form. This changes everything because it leads us to understand that humanity's spirituality didn't begin where we've been told, but has much older and indeed African roots. Now I want you to reflect with me. Why does this information almost never reach people? Why don't schools teach this? Why don't churches and mosques talk about the fact that there was already a supreme God worshipped in Africa before Christ, Muhammad, and Moses? The answer is perhaps simple, because it shatters a narrative constructed over centuries. Accepting this truth is admitting that what we know as revealed tradition may, in reality, be a continuation of something much older. And this idea is uncomfortable for those who wish to maintain a monopoly on truth. This is where you come in, as a viewer of this video, because your reflection is crucial. When you hear this, what do you feel? Strangeness? Curiosity? Resistance? I want you to be honest and leave the word root in the comments if you believe that spirituality has a much older origin than we've been told. And if this sounds new and revealing to you, write "This opens my eyes," because that way we'll measure the impact of this revelation on the minds and hearts of those who follow this content. When we say that this African god was already worshipped before Christ, before Muhammad, before Moses, we're not dealing with a simple coincidence, but with a reality that can be verified in the chronology of history itself. Think about it. Moses lived around 1200 BC. Christ was born at the beginning of our era, and Muhammad received the revelation that gave rise to Islam in the 7th century AD. Now imagine something that already existed millennia before that, in grand temples, in structured rituals, in scriptures engraved in stone, in traditions passed down from generation to generation. This worship of an African god didn't emerge suddenly. It predates everything we know as Abrahamic tradition, and that's simply shocking. Before Abraham was called the father of faith, African peoples already spoke of a supreme creator. Before Moses ascended Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the law, African priests already taught about divine justice, the balance between good and evil, and the spiritual responsibility of human beings before the Creator. Before Christ preached about love, forgiveness, and eternal life, there was talk of rewards for the righteous and punishments for the wicked. And before Muhammad proclaimed that there is no God but Allah, African peoples already affirmed the supremacy of a single God over all other spiritual beings. It's important to understand that we're talking about thousands of years of difference. While the book of Genesis narrates the creation of the world, Africans already had creation myths that described how the universe came from nothing, how order arose from chaos, how life was breathed into humankind. These narratives were told long before the Torah was written, and when we compare the symbols, we notice striking echoes. The idea of a God who separates light from darkness, who organizes the world, who molds man from earth or clay, was already alive on African soil before the Hebrews even existed as a nation. And here, an intriguing question arises. Could Moses, educated in Egypt, have had no contact with these ideas? Could some of what was revealed to him have somehow already been imbued with African culture and religion? This reflection is inevitable, because Egypt, the spiritual heart of African antiquity, was the world's great school of knowledge. Kings, priests, and even foreign philosophers went there to learn. So how can we imagine that the Hebrew tradition, born in this context, would not have inherited or at least been inspired by elements of this more ancient spirituality? When we look at the timeline, we realize something that can completely deconstruct the traditional view. While Judaism began to organize itself around the 13th century BC, the worship of supreme deities in Africa had already existed for 3, 4, or even 5,000 years before that. Christianity emerged in the 1st century AD, but the belief in judgment after death, in reward and punishment, and in eternal life had already been preached on the African continent for centuries. Islam emerged in the 7th century, but much of its concept of submission to the one God echoes ideas that were already present in African traditions millennia earlier. Now, I want you to think with me. If something existed long before, and if the religions we know appeared later with similar ideas, doesn't this point to a spiritual heritage? Wasn't the African God, in a way, humanity's first revelation, and everything that came after are variations of that same truth? This question isn't just academic, it's spiritual. It touches our faith because it forces us to recognize that perhaps the origin of human devotion to a creator is much closer to Africa than we imagine. And it's not just about vague dates and chronologies. We're talking about a spiritual legacy that spans time. Every time you read about the Last Judgment, you might remember that the Egyptians already spoke of the scales of justice. Every time you read about the power of the Holy Spirit, you might perceive echoes of the messenger spirits already active in African religions. Every time you hear that God is light, you might remember that the sun was seen as a symbol of supreme divinity in African antiquity. All of this demonstrates a continuity, an invisible thread that unites the oldest traditions with the most recent. It's as if we were standing before a great spiritual river. It rises from an African source, pure, deep, and ancient. It then divides into various channels: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But the origin is one, and recognizing this is recognizing that faith has roots older than we imagine, roots that cannot be torn from Africa. Now I want you to join me in this reflection. I want you to comment below on the word origin if you believe Africa is the root of human spirituality, and if this revelation is so powerful that it shakes everything you believed. Comment on the phrase, "This changes my perspective." These comments aren't just words. They help create a chain of people who are awakening to a greater truth, and they also help strengthen this channel so that more people receive this knowledge that has been hidden for so long. When we begin to look closely at this African God, who was already worshipped centuries before the Abrahamic religions, we notice something truly shocking. The similarities with the God of the Bible are so evident that they are impossible to ignore. The first of these is in the creation account. While Genesis presents us with a God who organizes chaos, separates light from darkness, creates man from the dust of the earth, and breathes into him the breath of life, much older African traditions already spoke of a creator who brought order to the universe, who formed human beings from clay or dust, and who gave them something divine to live by. It's almost as if we're faced with the same message in two different languages, separated only by time and culture. This idea of a God who creates humankind not just as any creature, but as someone with a spirit, someone carrying within them the divine spark, is a very strong connection between African traditions and the Bible. Humankind was seen not simply as flesh, but as body, soul, and spirit. This tripartite view of the human being appears clearly in the Christian tradition and in the letters of the Apostle Paul, but it was already present in Africa long before Christianity even existed. This leads us to an inevitable question. Was Moses, educated in Egypt, familiar with these African beliefs? Was the biblical view of human creation influenced by ideas already circulating in African spirituality? And it doesn't stop there. When we look at the question of life after death, we see another striking parallel. The Bible tells us about heaven, hell, the final judgment, a moment when everyone will appear before God to give an account of their actions. Now compare this with African beliefs, which already spoke of the soul's journey, of judgment before a divine scale, where the heart would be weighed to determine whether the person lived righteously or not. This image is practically identical to what was later translated into the Christian imagination as the final judgment. It's no coincidence. It's an echo, a continuity, a spiritual root that unites these traditions. Another essential point is the struggle between light and darkness. The Bible constantly presents God as light and evil as darkness. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all, says the first letter of John. But long before this verse was written, African traditions already spoke of the opposition between light and darkness, between order and chaos, between life and death. The sun, symbol of the supreme creator, was seen as the source of life, while the absence of light was associated with ignorance, evil, and that which led man astray. This polarity, so central to the Christian faith, already existed on African soil millennia earlier. And then there's the theme of divine judgment. The Bible shows us a God who is not only a creator but also a judge, who observes every human act and rewards or punishes according to justice. This conception of a just God who weighs the human heart is exactly the same as we find in African traditions. This God was not distant. He was deeply involved with morality, with human behavior, with the demand for justice. He was not indifferent. He cared about goodness, righteousness, and how each person lived their life. And what about the idea of a mediator? The Bible speaks of prophets, messenger angels, and Christ as the one who intercedes between God and humanity. African traditions already held this conception that the supreme god was aided by spirits, messengers, and entities that acted as a bridge between the divine and the human. This does not diminish the supreme god. On the contrary, it shows that he was above all, but that he chose means to communicate with humanity. Once again, we are faced with a direct similarity. Now think with me. If Moses grew up in Egypt amidst this spiritual environment, didn't he absorb many of these ideas? Could it be that when he wrote about creation, about the afterlife, about the struggle between light and darkness, about a God who judges and demands justice, he wasn't echoing concepts that had already circulated for centuries among African peoples? This question is uncomfortable, but it cannot be ignored. And perhaps that's precisely why this theme is so impactful. Because if we recognize these similarities, we have to admit that the God of the Bible did not emerge in isolation, as if he were an absolute novelty, but rather that he represents the continuity of a much older spiritual tradition, already alive in Africa. This doesn't diminish faith. On the contrary, it broadens it, because it shows us that the Creator has revealed himself in different times and places, and that the roots of human faith are much deeper than we've been told. Now, I want you to reflect and participate in this conversation. Leave the word light in the comments if you believe this connection between ancient Africa and the Bible resonates with you. And if the idea of divine judgment was already a strong part of your faith, write divine justice in the comments. This will show that you've not only listened, but are also reflecting with me on how these similarities can change the way we view humanity's spiritual history. So far, we've talked about concepts, beliefs, and similarities. But you might be wondering, where's the evidence for all this? Where are the records that show that this worship of an African god existed long before Moses, Christ, or Muhammad? And this is where the story becomes even more intriguing, because we're not just talking about oral tradition or accounts passed down from generation to generation. We're talking about concrete evidence, engraved in stone, painted on walls, carved in temples, written on papyrus, and even documented by historians who lived thousands of years ago. Consider Egyptian hieroglyphics, for example. When we look at the walls of the temples of Karnak, Luxor, or the pyramids, we see not just symbols, but veritable sacred narratives. These records speak of a creator God, the one who existed before all things, who brought order to chaos, and who sustained life. There are passages that describe how this God formed the world from primordial waters, how he breathed life into humanity, and how he established justice as the foundation of creation. These ideas are there, not invented by modern archaeologists, but recorded thousands of years ago, long before the Torah was written. Furthermore, ancient texts, such as the so-called Book of the Dead, contain prayers, chants, and instructions for the afterlife. In these pages, we find descriptions of the judgment of the soul, the divine tribunal, and the God who weighs the hearts of men. This is powerful evidence that the idea of divine judgment, which today seems exclusive to the Bible and Christianity, was already part of African spirituality long before. What for many is merely Egyptian mythology actually reveals itself to be a preview of concepts that would later be incorporated and reinterpreted in other religious traditions. But it's not just Egypt. In different regions of Africa, archaeologists have found symbols and inscriptions that point to the existence of a supreme deity. Ancient sculptures show figures representing the Creator, sometimes associated with the sun, light, and the cycle of life, but always portrayed as the supreme power that stands above all other spiritual beings. These records are evidence that cannot be ignored, because they show that the worship of the supreme African god was not just a popular belief, but part of a solid, organized, and recorded social and religious structure. And we cannot forget the accounts of ancient historians. Herodotus, considered the father of history, wrote about the Egyptians and described their cults, mentioning their reverence for supreme deities who had characteristics of a universal creator. Other Greek and Roman historians who visited Africa recorded spiritual practices that were impressive for their depth and similarity to concepts that would later appear in Judaism and Christianity. This means that we are not dealing with modern inventions, but with facts that were already recognized and commented on by observers of the time. Now imagine with me the scene of someone entering an African temple thousands of years ago. On the walls they see representations of the sun as a symbol of divine life. In sculptures they notice human figures in a prayer position before an invisible deity. On papyri, they read instructions for living a righteous life and preparing for the judgment that would come after death. All of this shows that faith in a supreme creator was not a theory, but a living practice, present in the daily lives of the people. And once again, the nagging question arises. Was Moses, who grew up and educated in Egypt, completely unaware of all this? How can we deny that, living surrounded by temples, sculptures, and texts that spoke of a creator, he wasn't influenced by these ideas? Wasn't he echoing concepts already etched in stone thousands of years earlier when he wrote about a God who creates the world, who demands justice, who judges mankind? This reflection is inevitable, and the historical evidence screams out. To those with eyes to see, these records cannot be erased. They are there, before us, and every time someone tries to hide or minimize their importance, just look at the temples, the manuscripts, the preserved accounts. The weight of the evidence is so great it's almost disturbing. Because if we admit that these African peoples already knew and worshipped a supreme God, we will have to rethink the entire narrative of where faith began. And this is precisely where I want to engage you even more in this reflection. Because it's not just about ancient history, but about your faith, your understanding of spirituality. When you see that hieroglyphics, texts, and sculptures speak of something so similar to what the Bible presents, what does this awaken in you? Curiosity? Resistance? A sense of revelation? I want you to leave the word proof in the comments if you believe the historical evidence confirms this connection. And if this discovery is so impactful that it changes your way of seeing the Bible and the history of religions, write, "This truth was hidden." These comments are crucial because they show not only that you're following along, but that you're reflecting along with me, and they help strengthen engagement so that more people have access to this content. Have you ever noticed that whenever we talk about topics that challenge the official narrative, there's a certain resistance, almost as if there were an invisible wall trying to prevent this knowledge from coming to light? Well, that's exactly what happens when the topic is this African God who came before Christ, Muhammad, and Moses. Because if there is evidence, if there are texts, sculptures, hieroglyphics, and even historical accounts that point to this reality, why is this knowledge rarely taught? Why have most people never heard of it, even though they've attended schools, universities, or religious institutions their entire lives? The answer can be summed up in one word: concealment. There was indeed a systematic effort to silence, erase, or divert people's attention from this truth. And here we enter the realm of the forbidden side of history, that which we don't want you to know. From the earliest empires, through the medieval church, and up to the present day, there has been an interest in maintaining a single, centralized narrative that reinforced the idea that revelation began only at a specific point in history, and that everything that came before was mere mythology or superstition. This was a strategy, and a very well-calculated one. Because think with me, if humanity knew that a God was already worshipped in Africa millennia before, if it knew that concepts such as creation, judgment, light versus darkness, life after death, and divine justice already existed there, what would become of the authority of the empires and religions that later presented themselves as the sole guardians of truth? This revelation would shake power structures, overturn the idea of exclusivity, and show that faith is much older and broader than official versions have led us to believe. This is precisely why so many texts were destroyed, so many temples were looted, and so many traditions were marginalized. European colonization, for example, not only dominated African territories but also silenced spiritual knowledge. They labeled what was a structured and profound spirituality paganism. They rewrote history so that Africa was seen not as the cradle of faith, but merely as an exotic setting. The word forbidden appears strongly here, because access to this knowledge was intentionally restricted. And the censorship wasn't just external, but also internal. How many religious leaders have heard of these connections and chosen to remain silent so as not to raise questions within their community? How many universities prefer to treat these records as mythology rather than acknowledge the spiritual depth they hold? This is proof that we're not just talking about forgotten history, but about a censored history, intentionally suppressed, because exposing the truth would risk losing control over millions of minds and hearts. The curious thing is that, despite all this effort to hide it, the signs remain there, right before our eyes. The temple walls, the preserved manuscripts, the intact sculptures, the rituals that have survived the test of time. All this bears witness to the fact that African spirituality is much older than officially acknowledged. And whenever someone tries to divert attention by calling it superstition, one only needs to look at the parallels with the Bible, the Quran, and other sacred books to realize that there's no denying it. The roots are there. And here I want to make you reflect with me very directly. Is the silence surrounding this African god merely historical neglect? Or is there something much larger, a conscious project to keep this knowledge hidden? Could censorship be not just an academic issue, but also a spiritual one? Because acknowledging this truth would take the monopoly of faith from the hands of a few and restore to people the notion that God revealed himself long before and in many more places than we've been told. This is the forbidden side, the uncomfortable side, the side that shakes the structure. Because if we admit that Africa already knew and worshipped a supreme God, we need to reevaluate everything: the chronology of faith, the exclusivity of revelation, and even the role that history has assigned to each religion. This is such a powerful revelation that it could provoke a true revolution in the way we understand spirituality. And perhaps that's precisely why this topic generates so much resistance, because it touches on something profound, something that goes beyond books and historical evidence. It touches on identity, power, and faith. That's why it's been hidden, stifled, called a myth. But here, in this video, we're breaking that silence and bringing to light what has been kept in the shadows. Now I want you to join me in this process. I want you to leave the word forbidden in the comments if you believe this knowledge has been intentionally censored. And if you believe this revelation is so powerful that it should be taught in all schools and churches, write the phrase, "This truth needs to be told." Your participation is essential because each comment shows that we are awakening to something that can no longer be hidden. After reflecting on the hidden and forbidden side of this knowledge, we arrive at an even deeper question. How do these African beliefs interact with today's spirituality? Could what seemed distant, lost in time, have something to teach us about who we are and where we are going? The answer, for those who look sincerely, is clear. Yes, there is a connection, and it is so strong that it makes us realize there is a universal truth that transcends religions, traditions, and cultures. When we talk about spirituality, we often think of something divided. On one side, Christian; on the other, Muslim, Jewish, African, and Asian, each with their own faith. But when we look at their roots, we realize there's an invisible thread that connects all these traditions. This thread is precisely the search for the sacred, for the Creator, for eternal life, for justice, for the light that overcomes darkness. And it's impressive how African spirituality already embraced all of this even before the books we consider sacred today were written. Consider the concept of the soul. For ancient Africans, the human being was not just a body, but also a spirit and divine essence. Today, in Christianity, this idea is central: body, soul, and spirit. In Islam, the soul is spoken of, which will be judged by Allah. In Judaism, there is also the belief that the breath of God dwells within the human being. Is it a coincidence that different traditions in different places and times speak of the same thing? Or are we faced with a universal truth, a revelation given from the beginning, which each people has translated in their own way? Another clear example is the practice of prayer. African peoples already believed that connection with the Creator could be achieved through words, song, and inner silence. Today, in any religion, prayer is the bridge between the human and the divine. This shows that the language or form doesn't matter. What matters is the essence: speaking to God, seeking His presence, recognizing His sovereignty. This is a universal experience, and the fact that it is present in such ancient traditions proves that it comes from a common source. And what about the struggle between good and evil? For Africans, life was a constant spiritual battle, in which the Creator demanded that human beings choose justice, righteousness, and truth. This same language appears in the Bible when God demands holiness from His people. It appears in Islam when Muhammad speaks of submission to Allah's will as the path to overcoming evil. It appears in Hinduism and Buddhism as the battle between ignorance and enlightenment. This is no coincidence. It is a sign that humanity has always known, on some level, that a higher moral order exists, one that transcends cultures and religions. And here's a point that's perhaps the most striking. Africa has always taught that the Creator was one, even if represented in different ways. This spiritual monotheism, this notion that there is only one supreme power above all, is precisely the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This shows that the connection is not merely superficial, but deep and structural. It's as if African spirituality were a seed planted in the heart of humanity, and from this seed sprouted different trees, each with its own form, but all connected to the same root. And it is at this point that the question I want to leave echoing in your heart arises. Is there a universal truth that transcends religions? Could it be that deep down all spiritual traditions are trying to point to the same Creator, the same God, just with different names and languages? If this is true, then we need to open our eyes and recognize that faith is much greater than borders, dogmas, or labels. Spirituality is not exclusive to one religion or one people. It is a universal calling, engraved in the human soul since ancient times. When you realize this, something changes within you. Because suddenly, instead of looking at others with suspicion because of their religion, you begin to see them as someone who also seeks the same God, who also desires justice, light, and truth. This is the spiritual connection that ancient Africa already taught us, that there is one Creator, and that we are all part of this great human family seeking eternity. And now I want to hear from you. I want you to leave the word universal in the comments if you believe there is a greater truth that transcends all religions. And if this reflection opened your eyes to faith in a new way, write the phrase, "Spirituality is greater than religion." These comments are not just words. They are part of a movement, part of a community that is awakening to the fact that humanity's spiritual history is much deeper and more connected than we imagined. After everything we've seen so far, it's time to pause and reflect more personally and directly. This isn't just about historical information, nor religious comparisons, but about something that touches our own faith. I want you to think with me, slowly, how all this affects your spiritual vision. What does it mean to you to discover that an African god was already worshipped before Christ, before Moses, before Muhammad? How does this change the way you understand the Bible, the Quran, and the religious traditions that have always been taught as the sole holders of truth? This revelation isn't just an academic detail. It's something that can shake or strengthen your faith, depending on how you respond to it. You might ask yourself, will my belief remain intact after knowing this? Or do I need to rethink everything I've learned so far? These are legitimate questions, and silence in the face of them doesn't solve the problem. On the contrary, it's sincere questioning that takes us to a deeper level of spirituality. Imagine for a moment that you've spent your life believing that history began at a specific point, but now discover that its roots are much older, and that humanity's faith began not in Israel or Arabia, but in the heart of Africa. How does this resonate within you? Does it make you feel betrayed by a narrative that never mentioned this fact? Or on the contrary, does it expand your faith, showing that God has always been present, revealing himself to different peoples, in different eras, long before any sacred book was written? I want to ask you some direct questions. What does this change in your faith? Does your view of God remain the same after this revelation? Does your trust in the Bible remain the same? Or do you begin to see it differently, perhaps as part of a larger story rather than the absolute origin? And if so, don't we need to rethink how we understand the word truth? These questions aren't meant to leave you lost, but to make you think. Because a faith that can't bear questions isn't faith, it's an illusion. And a truth that fears investigation can hardly be called truth. If the African god was already worshipped long before, this shows that God was never confined to a single religion, a single people, or a single book. He has always been present, revealing himself, calling, speaking to humanity in diverse ways. This doesn't diminish the Bible or the Quran, but it shows that they are part of something much greater. And here comes a powerful reflection. Wasn't this universal truth right there in front of us all along, but hidden because someone feared we'd discover it? Isn't spirituality greater than any organized religion? If there is a divine spark within every human being, as so many African traditions have asserted, then we all carry within us proof that God is universal, eternal, and has always been here. Now I want you to be honest with yourself. When you hear this, what do you feel? Strangeness, fear, liberation, a new perspective? There's no right or wrong answer. What matters is that you recognize within yourself the impact of this revelation. Because it's not just about ancient history, but about your relationship with the divine. And to make this reflection even more vivid, I'd like to invite you to participate in the comments. If you believe your faith remains the same, write, "My faith remains." But if this revelation has made you rethink everything, comment, "My vision has changed." These comments aren't just words, they're records of how this content is affecting people, and they're fundamental to creating a community that thinks, reflects, and grows together. When we look at these ancestral African beliefs and place them alongside today's spirituality, we perceive something that goes far beyond mere coincidence. It's as if there were an invisible thread connecting past, present, and future, showing that humanity, since ancient times, has always sought the same thing: a connection with the divine. What we see in today's sacred texts didn't emerge from nothing. It didn't emerge as an isolated idea in a specific corner of the world. African spirituality already spoke of a supreme God, of life after death, of justice, of light versus darkness, of purity of heart. And all of this speaks to our beliefs today in such a clear way that it is impossible to deny. Consider the concept of prayer. Today, within Christian churches, mosques, and synagogues, we see people turning to God with words, songs, and supplications. But long before that, African peoples believed that contact with the Creator occurred through the spoken word, through repeated chanting, through the rhythm of the drum that uplifted the soul. This connection between music, voice, and spirituality is not just a cultural detail. It is evidence that prayer has always been understood as a path to the sacred. The difference lies only in form, but the essence is the same. And what about divine justice? In the Bible, we find countless passages that speak of God as judge, the one who weighs the heart, who knows the deepest intentions of human beings. In Islam, we find the idea that all actions will be recorded and presented before Allah on the Day of Judgment. But long before that, African traditions already described the spiritual tribunal where the human heart was weighed, where each act would be considered to determine the fate of the soul. This shows that spirituality is not fragmented. It is a single message, expressed in different languages over time. This is where a reflection arises that may be uncomfortable for some, but liberating for others. Is there a universal truth that transcends religions? Could it be that what we call Christian, Jewish, Islamic, or even Eastern traditions are, at their core, different translations of the same revelation? Could it be that, in the end, we are all seeking the same Creator, just with different names and paths? This question is powerful because it breaks down barriers and shows that spirituality is greater than any religious system. When you look at this honestly, you realize that it's not a matter of relativizing faith, but of deepening it. Recognizing that ancient Africa already spoke of a supreme creator doesn't diminish the Bible, the Quran, or any tradition. On the contrary, it broadens it. It shows that God wasn't limited to one people, one nation, one religion. He has always been revealing himself, always calling humanity to himself. This realization is transformative because it takes us out of the narrow space of "my way is the only way" and places us in the broad space of universal truth. And this speaks directly to contemporary spirituality. We live in a time when many people no longer feel represented by traditional religions, but continue to seek meaning, seek connection, seek answers. This spiritual thirst is not new. It is the same one that moved African people to look to the sky, to raise their voices in song, to believe that life did not end with death. It is the same thirst that led Moses to the mountain, Christ to the desert, Muhammad to the cave. It is the same quest, just in different settings. Now, I want to ask you a direct question. What if, deep down, all of humanity is searching for the same God, just with different names? How does this change your faith? Does it make you feel closer to people of other religions, recognizing that deep down, they too are trying to connect with the Creator? Or does it challenge you to rethink the exclusivity you've always believed existed? This reflection is necessary because it shows that spirituality can be a point of unity, not just separation. And realize how this brings relief to the soul. Because instead of thinking that only a small group has access to the truth, you begin to see that God has always been revealing himself to everyone. That even before Moses, Christ, or Muhammad, he was already speaking to Africa. That even before any book was written, he was already engraving his message in hearts. This shows that spirituality is not the property of a religion, but a universal gift from divinity to humanity. And now I want to hear from you. I want you to leave the word universal in the comments if you believe that spiritual truth goes beyond religion. And if this reflection made you realize that faith is much greater than borders, dogmas, and labels, right, spirituality is greater than religion. These comments not only record your reaction, but also help create a community of people who are awakening to a deeper understanding of spirituality. After everything we've explored so far, it's time to pause and look within, because it's no use simply knowing historical facts, analyzing hieroglyphics, comparing traditions, or understanding chronologies. Ultimately, all of this needs to descend from the level of information to the level of reflection. This is where history ceases to be just a narrative about ancient peoples and begins to be a mirror for our own spiritual lives. And that's why I want to speak directly to you now. How does all this change your faith? That's the central question. Does your view of the Bible remain the same after discovering that fundamental concepts like creation, divine judgment, light versus darkness, and life after death already existed long before in African traditions? Does your confidence in everything you've learned so far remain the same? Or does a restlessness arise within you, a need to reconsider certain certainties? I know these questions may seem uncomfortable. Often, our minds have been trained to reject anything that challenges the vision we've held since childhood. But spirituality isn't built on walls, but on bridges. And every time we encounter something that challenges us, we have the opportunity to deepen our faith even further rather than abandon it. Asking questions isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of courage. Questioning isn't a sign of doubt, it's a sign of spiritual maturity. So I ask you again, what does it mean to you to discover that before Moses ascended Sinai, before Christ preached in Galilee, before Muhammad received his revelation, there was already an African god being worshipped as the supreme creator? Does this threaten your faith or expand your understanding? Does it make you think the Bible is wrong, or that perhaps it is just part of a larger story? A story that began much earlier and in places never mentioned in Sunday sermons. Be honest with yourself. Perhaps you feel resistance and almost physical discomfort. Perhaps you feel relief, like finding a missing piece in the puzzle of faith. Or perhaps you simply feel curiosity, a desire to keep searching. All of this is valid. The important thing is not to shy away from reflection, because a faith that cannot tolerate questions is not solid faith, it is merely repetition. And a God who is truthful does not fear investigation. Imagine that until now you believed that revelation began at a single point in history. Now you discover that it was already happening long before, in other lands, among other peoples. What does this awaken in you? Does this mean that God has always been revealing himself to all humanity, not just to a specific people? Could the message be greater than any organized religion? This possibility can be frightening, but it can also be liberating. And I want to challenge you. If your view of God changes after this revelation, is that a problem or an evolution? Does changing your perspective mean losing faith or gaining a broader, more mature, more conscious faith? I don't want you to just hear these words. I want them to become a conversation with your own soul. Ask yourself now, will my faith remain the same after this? Or has my vision changed and I'll never see things the same way again? This is the moment when you need to look within and realize that spirituality is not something imposed from the outside, but something that grows from within. It's like a flame that can be extinguished by fear or strengthened by the courage to face the truth. You have the choice to let this information pass as curiosity or allow it to transform your spiritual journey. Now I want to invite you to actively participate in this reflection. Write the phrase, "My faith remains," in the comments if you believe that none of this has shaken your confidence and that you remain firm in the vision you've always held. But if all of this has moved you, made you rethink your certainties and open new horizons, write, "My vision has changed." These comments aren't just quick responses. They're records of a collective awakening. And the more people participate, the stronger the community that's being formed around this hidden truth that has been hidden for so long becomes. If you've made it this far, it shows that this topic has truly resonated with you. So I want to ask you for 3 very simple things, but they make all the difference. First, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because we still have many revelations and hidden mysteries to explore together, and you don't want to miss a thing. Second, if this video brought you value, please like it now, because this helps YouTube understand that this content needs to reach even more people. And I want to propose a special challenge to those who stayed with me until the end. Comment below with the phrase, "I made it to the end and I want more revelations." That way, I'll know who truly belongs to this group of truth seekers committed to delving deep into this hidden knowledge. And of course, don't leave yet. Click on the next video that's appearing on the screen, because there we'll continue this journey and bring you even more hidden secrets that will open your eyes even further. I'll see you there.